The Baron was gasping for his last breath, while his wife was already picking out the black silk for his funeral. She didn't cry. She just watched the life drain out of him, waiting for the moment she could finally claim the keys to the kingdom. But what Baroness Claire didn't realize was that the only key that mattered wasn't on her husband's belt. It was the rusty, notched piece of scrap metal she'd soon toss at a slave's feet as a cruel joke. That joke was going to be the thing that stripped her of everything she murdered to get. The auctioneer's hammer was already being polished, and the shackles were being oiled for the morning. Claire thought she was erasing a legacy, but she was actually unlocking her own ruin. The air in Louisiana doesn't just sit. It weighs on you. It's thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting cypress, and the heavy scent of jasmine that tries to hide the stench of the slave quarters. On the Sterling plantation, that air felt twice as heavy the day Baron Sterling stopped breathing. He was a man of iron and ink, a man who built an empire out of the swamp and treated his ledgers like holy scripture. He wasn't a soft man, but he was a man of his word, which made him a rare breed in those parts. For 20 years, Elias had been the one to keep the Baron's world moving. As the head blacksmith, Elias didn't just shoe horses or fix wagon wheels. He was the master of the forge, the man who understood the language of fire and metal. He knew the click of every lock on the estate because he had built half of them himself. Take a look at this. Some folks call this tradition, but it's just cold-blooded cruelty with a fancy name. Elias was 45 years old, with hands that looked like they were carved out of oak and a memory that never let go of a detail. He had spent 2 decades watching the Baron, listening to the way the man spoke, and more importantly, watching the people who surrounded him. He saw the way Baroness Claire looked at the estate, not as a home, but as a pile of chips at a high-stakes poker table in New Orleans. Claire was younger than the Baron, 32 years old, with eyes that stayed cold even when she was smiling. She had a hunger for the city, for the lights, and for the gambling dens where she had managed to pile up debts that the Baron refused to pay. The trouble started 3 weeks before the funeral. The Baron had been healthy, a big man with a voice like a cannon, and then suddenly he wasn't. It started with a stomachache, then a fever that wouldn't break, and finally a weakness that left him pinned to his bed like a butterfly under glass. Elias would walk past the big house and see the flickering lights in the upstairs window. He heard the whispers in the kitchen. Old Martha, the cook who had been there since the Baron was a boy, stopped singing her gospel songs. Her eyes were wide and rimmed with red. She had seen things. She had seen the Baroness hovering over the medicine bottles, her silk sleeves rustling as she dropped something into the tea that wasn't prescribed by any doctor. Martha told Elias one night behind the smokehouse, her voice barely a tremor. She told him about the smell of bitter almonds that lingered in the Baron's room, a smell that didn't belong in a sickbed. But in Louisiana in those days, a slave's word wasn't just worth nothing. It was a death sentence if you pointed it at the wrong person. So Martha stayed quiet, and Elias stayed at his forge, hammering out the anger into red-hot iron. He saw the Baroness through the window of the study, burning papers in the fireplace while her husband was upstairs fighting for air. She wasn't destroying trash. She was destroying the future. When the Baron finally died, the house didn't go into mourning. It went into a frenzy. Claire didn't wait for the body to get cold before she called for Silas, the overseer. Silas was a man who enjoyed the sound of a whip more than the sound of music. He was a brute who had always hated Elias because the Baron respected the blacksmith's skill. With the Baron gone, Silas saw an opportunity to finally break the man who walked with his head a little too high. Claire told Silas to prepare the inventory. She wasn't just selling the cotton, she was selling the people. She needed the money to pay off the men in New Orleans who were tired of waiting for her to settle her losses. The day of the will reading was a performance. The neighbors came, the creditors came, and the sheriff stood by the door making sure everything was handled according to the law. Elias and the other workers were lined up in the yard, standing in the blistering sun, while the air hummed with the sound of locusts. Claire came out onto the porch, dressed in black lace that cost more than a year's profit from the forge. She held a piece of paper that she claimed was the Baron's final testament. According to that paper, the Baron had changed his mind about everything. He hadn't left the workers their freedom or the small plots of land he had promised them for years. Instead, the paper said everything went to Claire and the surplus labor, which meant every human being standing in that yard, was to be sold to the highest bidder to settle the estate's debts. A low moan went through the crowd, a sound of pure heartbreak, but Claire just smirked behind her veil. Then she looked at Elias. She walked down the steps, her heels clicking on the stone like a countdown. She looked him in the eye, her face a mask of triumph. She reached into a small velvet bag and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron key. It was a strange-looking thing, with a double-notched bit and a coat of orange corrosion so thick it looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of the bayou. She held it up for everyone to see, a mocking glint in her eyes. "My husband always spoke of your loyalty, Elias," she said, her voice dripping with fake honey. "He wanted you to have a special inheritance. Since you love your metal so much, he left you this. A piece of junk for a piece of property." She dropped the key into the dust at his feet. The creditors laughed. Silas stepped forward and spat near the key. Claire leaned in closer so only Elias could hear her. "Tomorrow morning the traders will be here. I'm selling you to a labor camp in the swamps. I want you to spend the rest of your short life thinking about how much your loyalty was worth. If you don't have a stomach for these high society lies, subscribe to the channel. And tell me, was that rusty key a mistake or a death sentence?" Elias didn't say a word. He didn't flinch when the laughter hit him. He reached down with his calloused hand and picked up the key. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. As his fingers closed around the cold metal, he felt something Claire hadn't noticed. The rust was thick, yes, but the weight of the iron told him it wasn't just any metal. It was high-grade steel underneath that corrosion, the kind he used for the most important jobs. And the notches, he knew those notches. He had filed them himself years ago in the middle of the night, while the Baron sat in the forge and watched the door. Silas stepped forward and grabbed Elias by the shoulder, shoving him toward the holding pens. "Move it, blacksmith. You've got one night left on this soil. Make it count." Elias was thrown into a small wooden shack near the forge, his hands shackled with the very irons he had maintained. The door was bolted from the outside, and Silas stood guard for a while, nursing a bottle of whiskey and bragging about how he was going to take over the forge's profits once Elias was gone. Inside the dark shack, the heat was stifling. Elias sat on the dirt floor, the rusty key pressed against his palm. He closed his eyes and let his mind go back to a rainy Tuesday 2 years ago. The Baron had come to the forge late, looking pale and worried. He hadn't talked about cotton or money. He had talked about insurance. He had asked Elias to build a box that no fire could melt and no axe could break. He had asked for a lock that didn't use a standard tumbler, a lock that required a double-notched bit. Elias remembered the night they buried it. They hadn't gone to the woods or the cemetery. The Baron had pointed to the floor of the forge, right beneath the main anvil stand. "The best place to hide something," the Baron had whispered, "is right under the feet of the man who guards it." They had dug 3 feet down, through the packed earth and the layers of soot and ash. They had placed the iron box there and covered it with a heavy stone plate that looked just like the rest of the floor. Elias looked at the key in the moonlight, filtering through the cracks in the wall. He realized then that the Baroness had made a fatal mistake. She had seen a piece of rust and thought it was trash because she didn't understand the value of honest work. She thought she was mocking Elias, but she had actually handed him the only weapon that could destroy her. The Baron must have known he was being poisoned. He must have known Claire would find his formal papers and burn them. So he gave the real truth to the only person he could trust to keep it, the man she would never suspect of holding the power. But there was a problem, a big one. Elias was in chains, a guard was outside, and the auction was only hours away. The sheriff was a fair man, but he wouldn't listen to a slave story without proof. If Elias couldn't get to that box, if he couldn't open it and show the world what was inside, he would be gone by sunrise, and the truth would be buried forever under the soot of the forge. He heard the sound of Silas snoring outside, the whiskey finally taking hold. Elias looked at his shackles. He knew the anatomy of these locks. He had made them. He reached for a small, thin piece of wire he kept tucked into the hem of his trousers, a habit of a man who never fully trusted his freedom. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had to do. He had to be silent. He had to be fast, and he had to pray that the key, despite the rust, still had enough bite left to turn the lock that held the Baron's ghost. The moon climbed higher over the Louisiana swamp, casting long, jagged shadows across the plantation. In the distance, a hound howled, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the tension in the air. Elias felt the wire click inside the mechanism of his shackles. One wrist came free, then the other. He stood up, his joints popping, and looked toward the forge. The silhouette of the anvil stood like a silent sentinel. He knew exactly where the stone plate was. He knew exactly what he would find, but he also knew that Baroness Claire was upstairs in her silk bed, dreaming of New Orleans, unaware that the blacksmith she had mocked was about to turn the key on her entire life. Silas didn't just snore. He breathed with a heavy, wet rattle that sounded like a saw cutting through damp wood. Every few minutes, the sound would hitch, and the overseer would grunt in his sleep, his hand twitching toward the leather whip coiled at his belt even in his dreams. Elias stayed frozen against the rough wooden wall of the shack, his lungs burning as he held his breath. He had managed to slip the shackles, but the silence of the Louisiana night was a trap of its own. Out here, a snapping twig sounded like a gunshot, and the rustle of a dry leaf could bring a man like Silas onto his feet with a knife in his hand. Elias looked at the rusty key in his palm, the metal biting into his skin. He didn't just need to get out. He had to get to the forge, and he had to do it before the moon crossed the peak of the roof. The problem wasn't just Silas. The problem was the way Claire had set the stage. She hadn't just promised to sell Elias. She had already invited the buyers to watch the morning's work. 2 men from the Cyprus camps were already sleeping in the main house's guest quarters, men who viewed human beings as nothing more than fuel for the timber industry. They were looking for strong backs to break in the swamps, and Claire was looking for a way to erase the man who knew too much about her husband's final days. Elias knew that if he was caught now, there wouldn't be an auction. Silas would finish him right there in the dirt, and the Baroness would claim he died trying to escape. Think about this. Some people call this tradition, but it's just a mask for a crime that has a name and a face. Elias moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had spent his life working with fire. He knew that haste was the father of mistakes. He lowered himself to the ground, sliding through the gap in the floorboards he had loosened weeks ago just in case. The mud beneath the shack was cold and slick, smelling of old rot and stagnant water. He crawled through the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every inch felt like a mile. When he finally cleared the edge of the shack, he stayed low in the tall grass watching the silhouette of the big house. It sat on the hill like a white skull, its windows dark and empty, except for one. Claire was awake. He could see the faint glow of a candle moving behind the curtains of the Baron's old study. She was likely still looking for the ledger her husband had mentioned before the illness took his voice. She thought the paper was the only thing that could hang her, but she didn't understand the man she had married. The Baron was a man who knew the value of iron. He knew that paper burns, but metal endures. That was why he had come to Elias. That was why he had trusted a man in chains over the woman in his own bed. Elias reached the shadow of the forge, the familiar scent of coal dust and cold steel wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. This was his sanctuary, the only place on the plantation where he felt like a man instead of a tool. But tonight, the forge felt different. It felt like a tomb. He stepped inside, the floor crunching softly under his bare feet. He didn't dare light a lamp. He had to find the stone plate by touch alone. He knelt beside the massive anvil, his fingers searching the dirt. The floor of the forge was a map of his life. Every spill, every burn, every drop of sweat was recorded in that hard-packed earth. He found the edge of the anvil stand and moved 3 paces to the left. His fingers hit something cold and flat. The stone plate. It was buried under a thin layer of ash and soot, hidden so well that even Silas, who spent his days prowling the grounds, had never noticed it. Elias started to dig, his fingernails clawing at the dirt, but the ground was packed tight from years of heavy work. His breath came in ragged gasps. He needed a tool, but the sound of metal hitting stone would bring the whole plantation down on him. "You're digging in the wrong spot, Elias." The voice was a whisper, but it hit him like a physical blow. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy iron rod near the furnace. Standing in the doorway was Martha. She looked like a ghost in her white apron, her face etched with a level of terror that made her look 20 years older. She wasn't holding a lamp, but the moonlight caught the glint of tears on her cheeks. She stepped into the forge, her movements hurried and jerky. "Martha, you shouldn't be here," Elias hissed, his voice trembling with the adrenaline of the scare. "If Silas wakes up and finds you out of the quarters—" "Silas is a dog who's had too much bone," Martha interrupted, her voice sharp with desperation. "But the Baroness, she's the one you have to fear. She's already talking to the sheriff. She told him you stole the Baron's gold before he died. She's building a cage for you that doesn't have an auction block at the end of it. She wants you dead, Elias. She knows you saw her with that tea." Elias looked at the old woman, seeing the truth in her eyes. Martha had seen it all, the way Claire had hovered over the Baron's bed, the way she had smiled when the doctor said there was no hope. But Martha was also the one who knew the house's secrets better than anyone. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and wood smoke. "She's looking for a ledger, Elias, a book with red leather. She thinks it's in the study, but she's wrong. The Baron didn't just write down what she did. He wrote down who she owes. He wrote down the names of the men in New Orleans who paid for the poison. If you can't stand seeing a lie dressed up in silk, subscribe to the channel. And tell me, was that rusty key a symbol of hope or a death sentence?" Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. The box wasn't just about the will, it was about the murder. The dead man's ledger wasn't just a list of debts, it was a map of a conspiracy. The Baron had known he was dying, and he had spent his last days setting a trap that would spring long after he was in the ground. But the key in Elias's pocket was the only way to open it. He turned back to the dirt, digging with renewed ferocity. Martha knelt beside him, her small, frail hands helping him pull back the earth. "The key," she whispered. "The one she threw at you. She thought it was the key to the old tool chest she sold last year. She's a fool, Elias. She doesn't know the difference between a common lock and a master's work. It was small, no bigger than a cigar case, but it was heavy with the weight of the truth." Elias pulled it from the earth, the metal slick with mud. He wiped the lid with his sleeve, revealing the intricate scrollwork he had hammered into the steel 2 years ago. In the center was the keyhole, a strange double-notched opening that looked like a pair of screaming eyes. He pulled the rusty key from his pocket. This was the moment. If the rust had eaten too deep, if the mechanism had seized in the damp earth, it was over. He inserted the key. It resisted at first, the corrosion gritting against the internal tumblers. Elias felt a beads of sweat roll down his forehead. He forced himself to breathe, to remember the way he had built the lock. He didn't turn it with strength. He turned it with a locksmith's touch, feeling for the slight give in the metal. Click. The sound was small, but in the silence of the forge it sounded like a thunderclap. The lid of the box popped open a fraction of an inch. A faint, bitter smell drifted out, the scent of almonds, just like Martha had described. Inside, nestled in a piece of velvet, was a small half-empty glass vial labeled with a name that didn't belong to any medicine. Next to it was a folded piece of parchment, sealed with the Baron's personal signet ring, and a small, leather-bound book. "We have it," Elias whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We have the proof." But as he reached for the vial, the sound of a horse's hooves echoed from the driveway. Not one horse, several. And they weren't the slow, rhythmic trot of a traveler. They were moving fast, with the urgency of men on a mission. Martha scrambled to the door of the forge, her eyes widening as she looked toward the big house. "It's the creditors," she gasped. "The men from the city. They weren't supposed to be here until morning. The Baroness must have sent for them early. She's going to settle the debts tonight, Elias. She's going to sign the papers and sell the land before anyone can ask questions." Elias looked at the box, then at the house. He was still a runaway in the eyes of the law. He was standing in a forge with the evidence of a murder, but he had no way to get it to the sheriff without being shot on sight. Silas was surely awake by now, alerted by the arrival of the horses. The trap was closing, and the very thing that was supposed to save him was now the evidence that would get him killed if he was caught with it. He looked at Martha. "Go back to the kitchen. Act like you just woke up. If they find you here, they'll kill you too." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias closed the iron box and tucked it under his arm. He looked at the anvil, then at the glowing embers of the forge's hearth. He had one advantage left. The forge was his territory. He knew every shadow, every hiding place, and every tool. If Claire wanted to sell him, she would have to come and get him herself. And he was going to make sure that when she did, she walked right into the trap her husband had built for her. He heard Silas's voice shouting from the quarters, followed by the crack of a whip. The hunt was on. Elias didn't run for the woods. He didn't try to escape into the swamp. Instead, he climbed up into the rafters of the forge, pulling the shadows around him like a cloak. He watched as the lanterns flickered to life across the plantation, the orange light dancing on the walls of the big house. He saw the Baroness step out onto the porch, her face pale in the torchlight, looking like a queen surveying her crumbling empire. She thought she had won. She thought the blacksmith was a broken man waiting for his chains. But Elias wasn't waiting. He was watching. He held the iron box tight against his chest, feeling the cold steel through his shirt. The dead man's ledger was about to be opened, and the price of its contents was going to be paid in blood and silk. The game had changed. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice. And as the first of the creditors climbed the steps of the porch, Elias realized that the Baron hadn't just left him a key. He had left him the authority to burn the whole house down. Subscribe. We dig up what they tried to bury. And comment, do you think Silas was just a tool, or did he know about the poison all along? The first creditor, a man with a sharp nose and a coat that cost more than the forge itself, stepped into the light of the porch. He held a stack of papers in his hand, his eyes greedily scanning the horizon of the plantation. Claire smiled, a thin, predatory expression, and reached for the pen. She was seconds away from selling the world out from under the people who built it. But in the darkness of the forge, Elias gripped the iron box and waited for the perfect moment to strike the spark that would ignite the truth. The crack of the whip didn't hit flesh this time. It hit the wooden door of the empty shack where Elias was supposed to be waiting for his end. Silas let out a roar that sounded more like a wounded animal than a man. He had found the shackles lying on the dirt floor, cold and mocking. The whiskey haze was gone, replaced by a murderous clarity. He knew Elias hadn't run for the swamp. He knew the blacksmith too well. Elias was a man of the forge, and if he was going to make a stand, he'd do it where he felt the strongest. Silas turned toward the forge, his boots churning up the mud as he signaled the other guards. The hunt wasn't just about a runaway anymore. It was about pride. Inside the rafters of the forge, Elias pressed his back against a thick cypress beam. The iron box was tucked into the waistband of his trousers, the cold metal pressing against his skin. He could hear the heavy thud of Silas's heart, or maybe it was his own. Below him, the forge was a cavern of shadows. He had lived in this room for 20 years, but tonight it felt like a stranger's house. He watched through the gaps in the roof as lanterns began to swarm toward the building like angry fireflies. They were coming, and they weren't coming to talk. Repara niso. The law in those lands had the weight of gold, not the weight of justice. The door to the forge swung open with a violent groan. Silas stepped in, holding a lantern high, its orange light dancing off the tools and the anvil. He looked at the floor, his eyes instantly catching the disturbed earth where Elias and Martha had dug up the box. Silas knelt, running his fingers through the fresh dirt. He didn't see the box, but he saw the hole it had left behind. He looked up at the rafters, his eyes narrow and filled with a hateful intelligence. He knew Elias was there. He could smell the sweat and the desperation. "I know you're up there, blacksmith," Silas growled, his voice low and vibrating through the floorboards. "You think that little box is going to save you? You think a dead man's ghost can protect you from me?" He stood up and pulled a heavy iron poker from the cooling hearth. He didn't climb. He started striking the beams, the sound of metal on wood ringing like a funeral bell. "Come down and maybe I'll make it quick. Stay up there and I'll burn this whole place with you inside it." Just then, the rustle of silk announced the arrival of the Baroness. Claire stepped into the forge, her face pale and drawn. She looked at the hole in the ground and then at Silas. Her hands were shaking, clutching the hem of her black dress. She wasn't the triumphant queen from the porch anymore. She looked like a woman who had realized the floor was rotting beneath her feet. "Did you find it?" she hissed, her voice cracking. "Did he have the ledger?" "He's in the rafters, mistress," Silas said, not taking his eyes off the ceiling. "And he's got something. He dug it up right here." Claire looked up, her eyes searching the darkness. "Elias, give me that box and I'll let you go. I'll give you your freedom and enough coin to get to the north. Just drop the box, and this all ends." Elias almost laughed, but the sound stayed caught in his throat. He knew her lies. He knew that the moment he dropped that box, Silas would have a bullet in his head before the metal hit the floor. He looked at the iron box. It was a small thing, but it held the weight of a man's life and a woman's crimes. He thought about the Baron, a man who had been hard but fair, and how he had died in agony while his wife watched the clock. He thought about Martha, risking her life in the kitchen just to give him a warning. If you don't buy into these well-dressed lies, subscribe, and tell me, was this vial, the arsenic, a mistake, or a signed confession? The tension in the forge was thick enough to choke on. Elias knew he couldn't stay in the rafters. Silas was already calling for a torch to start the fire. But as Silas reached for a bundle of dry hay, a new sound cut through the chaos. A horse whinnied outside, followed by the authoritative voice of Sheriff Miller. The sheriff wasn't alone, the creditors were with him, the men who had come to collect the debts Claire had piled up at the gaming tables. They were tired of waiting, and they were tired of the Baroness's excuses. Sheriff Miller stepped into the forge, his silver badge glinting in the lantern light. He was a tall man, weathered by years of chasing outlaws and dealing with the complex politics of the plantation owners. He looked at Silas with the torch, then at the hole in the ground, and finally at the Baroness. "What's going on here, Claire? I thought we were here for an estate sale, not a lynching." "He's a thief, Sheriff," Claire cried, pointing a trembling finger at the rafters. "Elias stole my husband's private papers. He's trying to blackmail me. He escaped his shackles and tried to run." Miller looked up. He didn't draw his gun. He just stood there, his thumbs hooked into his belt. "Is that true, Elias? You got something that doesn't belong to you?" Elias took a deep breath. This was the moment. The logic of error was about to play out. Claire thought she could control the narrative because she was the one in the silk dress, but she had forgotten that the sheriff was a man who followed the ledger, not the lady. Elias shifted his weight, the cypress beam creaking under him. "I have what the Baron gave me, Sheriff," Elias called out, his voice steady and echoing through the room. "I have the inheritance that the Baroness laughed at." "He's lying!" Silas screamed, lunging toward the ladder that led to the rafters. But the sheriff's hand moved faster, his heavy revolver clearing leather and pointing straight at the overseer's chest. "Stand down, Silas," Miller said, his voice cold as a winter creek. "I'm the law here. If there's a thief, I'll be the one to judge. Elias, come down, bring the box. If you're telling the truth, you have nothing to fear. If you're lying, you'll be in the county jail by sunrise." Elias slowly lowered himself from the rafters, the iron box clutched in one hand. He hit the floor with a soft thud, the coal dust puffing up around his feet. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the sheriff, ignoring the murderous glare from Silas and the frantic, wide-eyed terror of the Baroness. He walked to the center of the forge, right next to the anvil, and placed the mud-covered box on the iron surface. The creditors crowded into the doorway, their faces masks of greed and curiosity. They wanted to know if there was gold in that box, or if it was just more of the Baron's secrets. Claire tried to push past the sheriff, her fingernails clawing at the air. "Don't open it. It's private. It's my husband's personal effects." "If it's his effects, then it belongs to the estate," Miller said, moving Claire aside with a firm arm. He looked at Elias. "The key?" Elias pulled the rusty, notched key from his pocket. He didn't give it to the sheriff. He held it up, the orange light making the rust look like dried blood. "This key doesn't belong to a slave, Sheriff. It belongs to the man she murdered." A collective gasp went through the room. The creditors whispered among themselves, and Claire's face went from pale to a ghostly white. She looked like she was about to faint, her hand reaching for the anvil stand to steady herself. "That's a lie, a desperate lie from a runaway." "Open it," Miller commanded, his eyes never leaving Elias. Elias inserted the key into the double-notched lock. He felt the mechanism resist one last time, as if the lock itself was hesitant to release the truth. Then, with a loud metallic click, the lid swung open. The smell hit everyone at once. the sharp, bitter scent of almonds that had no business being in a blacksmith's forge. The sheriff reached into the box and pulled out the glass vial. He held it up to the light, his brow furrowed as he read the label. Then he reached for the small leather-bound book, The Dead Man's Ledger. He flipped through the pages, his face hardening with every word he read. He saw the lists of gambling debts, the names of the men Claire had been meeting in secret, and finally the Baron's own handwriting, shaky and weak, describing the symptoms of his illness and the way his wife had been the only one to serve his tea. But there was something else in the box, something Elias hadn't expected. The sheriff pulled out a second piece of parchment, one that hadn't been burned in the study fireplace. It was a deed, signed and witnessed by a judge in New Orleans months before the Baron fell ill. Elias watched the sheriff's face. He saw the moment the man realized the scale of the injustice. He saw the way the sheriff looked at the Baroness, not as a grieving widow, but as a common criminal. The creditors were silent now, their greed replaced by a sudden, chilling realization that the estate they were trying to buy was a crime scene. "Claire Sterling," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with a new kind of authority. "This ledger doesn't just talk about money, it talks about arsenic. And this deed, it says this plantation doesn't belong to you. It hasn't belonged to you for a long time." The Baroness let out a scream of pure rage and lunged for the box, her fingers reaching for the vial. But Silas was faster. He saw the ship sinking and decided to save himself. He stepped in her way, his heavy hand catching her by the shoulder and shoving her back toward the sheriff. He was a brute, and he knew when the wind had changed. The forge, once a place of labor and chains, had become the courtroom. The air was still thick with the smell of coal and poison, but for the first time in 20 years, Elias felt a different kind of heat. The heat of a fire that was finally going to burn away the lies. He looked at the rusty key still sitting in the lock. It was the only thing that had survived the Baron's death, and it was the only thing that was going to give the living their due. The smell of bitter almonds didn't just fill the forge, it seemed to stain the very air, turning the scent of honest sweat and coal into something sickly and foul. Sheriff Miller held the small glass vial up to the lantern light, his eyes tracing the jagged handwriting on the label. He wasn't looking at a bottle of medicine, he was looking at a murder weapon. Baroness Claire stood frozen, her hand still reaching out as if she could claw the truth back into the darkness. But the iron box was open, the rusty key had done its work, and the dead man's ledger was now speaking for a man who had been silenced too soon. The silence in that room was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the oxygen out of the air. Miller didn't look at Claire. He looked at the leather-bound book, flipping through pages that were filled with the Baron's final desperate thoughts. He began to read aloud, his voice flat and hard like a gavel hitting a bench. He read the dates, every Tuesday and Thursday, the days the Baroness insisted on serving his tea herself. He read the descriptions of the cramps, the metallic taste in the mouth, and the way the Baron's legs had turned to lead. The Baron had known. He had used his final strength to record his own slow execution, turning his ledger from a book of business into a diary of a homicide. Reparanisso. Greed doesn't just blind a person. It leaves a trail of crumbs that even the smallest bird can find if it knows where to look. "It says here," Miller said, his voice echoing off the soot-stained walls, "that you weren't just impatient for the inheritance, Claire. You were desperate. You owed $40,000 to the gambling houses in New Orleans. You spent the plantation's future on the turn of a card, and when your husband found out, you decided he was worth more to you in a coffin than in his chair." The creditors in the back of the room began to mutter, their faces turning from greed to a cold, calculating fear. They realized they weren't just here for a sale, they were witnesses to a hanging offense. Claire's face twisted. The mask of the grieving widow finally shattered, revealing the jagged, ugly thing underneath. "That book is a forgery," she screamed, her voice hitting a note that made the iron tools on the wall vibrate. "He was a sick, delusional old man. You're going to take the word of a dead man and a slave over mine?" She looked around the room, searching for an ally, but even Silas had stepped back. The overseer was a brute, but he knew how to read a room, and he could see the gallows being built in the sheriff's eyes. Miller ignored her. He reached back into the box and pulled out the second item, the parchment with the Baron's personal seal. He unfolded it slowly, the paper crackling like a fire. This wasn't a ledger. It was a deed of trust, signed and witnessed by a judge in the city 6 months before the Baron's first stomachache. Miller's eyes widened as he read the fine print. He looked at Elias, then back at the paper. The logic of the error was finally complete. Claire thought she was selling the estate to cover her debts, but she didn't realize she hadn't owned a single acre of it for half a year. "This deed," Miller said, turning the paper so the creditors could see the official stamps, transferred the entire Sterling estate into a protected trust. It wasn't left to you, Claire. It was left to the workers, to Elias and the others. It says here that upon the Baron's death, the land was to be divided among the families who worked it, and the forge was to be deeded directly to Elias as a free man. A collective gasp went through the forge. Elias felt a wave of heat wash over him that had nothing to do with the furnace. The weight he had carried for 20 years, the weight of the chains, the weight of the hammer, the weight of being property, seemed to evaporate in a single second. If you can't stand seeing a murderer in silk get exactly what she deserves, subscribe and tell me, was this ledger an inheritance or a death sentence for a queen of lies? The Baroness let out a sound that wasn't human, a high, thin wail of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged at the sheriff, her fingers hooked like talons, trying to grab the deed. But Miller was a man of the frontier. He caught her wrists with one hand and spun her around, forcing her arms behind her back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music Elias had ever heard. It was the same sound he had heard every morning for 20 years, but this time the iron was going on the person who deserved it. "Silas!" Claire shrieked, struggling against the sheriff's grip. "Do something! Kill them! Kill them all!" Silas looked at her. Then he looked at the sheriff's heavy revolver, and then he looked at the creditors who were already backing out of the door to distance themselves from the scandal. Silas didn't move a muscle. He was a man who followed power, and Claire Sterling had just lost hers. He dropped the torch he was holding into a bucket of water, the hiss of the steam signaling the end of his reign of terror. He knew that without Claire's protection, the workers he had whipped for years would have their day, and he wasn't about to stick around to see it. He turned and vanished into the night, a coward running from the shadows he had helped create. Miller leaned in close to Claire's ear. "You wanted to sell Elias to a labor camp, didn't you? You wanted to erase him, but it looks like you're the one going on a trip. The prison in Baton Rouge has a special cell for women who poison their husbands. And don't worry about the estate. Elias will take good care of it." He shoved her toward the door where 2 deputies were waiting. As she was led out, her silk dress was dragged through the very mud she had forced Elias to kneel in. She was no longer a baroness. She was just a woman in a black dress heading toward a cage. The creditors were next. Miller looked at the man with the sharp nose, the one who had been so eager to buy the forge. "The sale is void. Every contract she signed is worth less than the dirt on your boots. If any of you try to set foot on this land again, you'll be answering to me and the new owners. Now get out before I decide to look into your gambling books too." The men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled for their horses, the sound of their retreat fading into the swamp. Elias stood by the anvil, the iron box still open before him. Martha stepped into the forge, her eyes wet with tears, and placed a hand on his shoulder. They were free. Not just because of a piece of paper, but because they had held on to the truth when it would have been easier to let it burn. The Baron had known that Elias was the only one strong enough to hold the key, and Elias had proven him right. The rusty piece of scrap metal was still sitting in the lock, a humble thing that had brought down a kingdom. The sun began to rise over the Louisiana horizon, casting a long golden light across the plantation. It wasn't the same sun that had set the night before. This morning, the air didn't feel heavy. The smell of the jasmine was sweet again, and the sound of the birds in the cypress trees didn't sound like a lament. Elias picked up his hammer, not because he had to, but because it was his. He looked at the forge, his forge, and realized that the Baron hadn't just given him land. He had given him the power to shape his own future, one strike of the iron at a time. Subscribe. Here we pull back the curtain on the things they tried to bury. And comment, do you think the Baron knew Elias would have the courage to wait for the right moment, Or was the key his only hope? Greed is a hungry fire that eventually consumes the person who lit it. Claire Sterling thought a rusty key was a joke, a worthless piece of junk to mock a man she considered beneath her. She forgot that a lock doesn't care about the gold on your fingers or the silk on your back. It only cares about the pattern of the steel. She spent her life trying to unlock doors to rooms she didn't belong in, only to find that the last door she'd ever passed through would be the one the sheriff locked behind her. Elias didn't need a title or a mansion to be a man of worth. He just needed the truth and the iron to back it up. In the end, the blacksmith didn't just fix a lock. He broke a legacy of cruelty and forged a new one out of the ruins.